And so we begin part 24 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos. This time I'll be covering basing Napoleonic figures, specifically 15mm. Not how to do this, that is in terms of flocking and gluing and all that sort of stuff, because I'm assuming by now you'll be fully experienced in doing the actual physical activity of basing. But more importantly, what size of base should I use and how many figures should I place on each base? This clearly is dependent on the rules being used, but the objective here is to identify the most common basing mechanism, guideline, method, which will be useful for as many rules as possible. In order to determine the optimal base size, we need to go through a list of rules and what base sizes those particular rules use. For simplicity, I'm only covering basing for 15mm figures, which these days tend to be the same base size for 6mm as well. So I suppose technically could also cover them, but it's mainly 15mm. The starting point will be WIG Wargames Rules 1685 to 1845, which I must admit are rather old rules, but nonetheless were very popular in their days. Back in 1979, the bases were 3cm wide, which we'll soon discover is no longer commonly used, primarily because the figures these days are much larger. But we all need to start somewhere, and WIG is where we'll start. Most elements in the WIG era are 3cm wide, with a depth which ranges from between 1cm and 2cm. There are many elements, such as artillery, which have a reduced width. However, this type of basing is also no longer used, so I will ignore these non-standard width type elements. Artillery depth ranges from between 2cm to 6cm, primarily in order to accommodate the figures. Let's now look at figures per base. Artillery is normally based one figure or one gun per base, with associated crews, limbers and horses. The other troops are based in what used to be called a close order, and open order, which is, respectively, 4 figures, 3 figures and 2 figures. The first point to make is these sizes are not common anymore. Figure size has grown so much that in many cases they simply do not fit on such a small base. If we go to another set of rules, which is in approximately the same era as WIG, in this case Empire 3rd edition. Now this set of rules does use inches, so I will convert their inches into the closest metric equivalent, with basically 1 inch equaling 3cm. Now of course this is not 100% correct, but is common. This common ratio is used with micro armor rules, so I'll use it here. Empire allows for individual figures to be based, so to achieve a level of consistency, let's use our close order, and open order density, which is respectively 4 figures a base, 3 figures a base, and 2 figures a base. Infantry in close order, or 4 figures per base, has a frontage of 1 1/8 inches, which can be rounded to 3cm, and a depth of ½ an inch, which is approximately 1.5cm. Infantry in open order, or 2 per base, has a frontage of 1 inch, which also probably makes it 3cm, and has a depth of ½ an inch, which once again is 1.5cm. Most cavalry is in open order, or 2 to a base, and it has a combined frontage of 1 1/2 inches, which makes it 4.5cm, and a depth of whatever is required. Some cavalry in open order, that is 2 to a base, has a frontage of 1 inch, which does make it 3cm, but this is very much in the minority. My conclusion from this is we can't really use Empire 3rd edition as any form of basing guide. I just basically believe these rules use such a different basing philosophy that it's difficult to convert to anything that we use today. Let's now move to Elan. Now, using these rules, we begin to see base widths of 4cm, with increased base depths as well. As these rules came in 2004, this is no surprise, as the increase in size of 15mm figures caused an increase in base size for ancients well before this date, and Napoleonics, for some strange reason, tends to get influenced by ancient basing. However, we still have this variable base width with open order cavalry, so it's not all 4 centimeters as you can see on this image here, but it is primarily 4 centimeters for the bulk of elements or figures that you deploy on the playing area. Let's now look at a DBN. Now this possesses 2 basing systems, the original, based on the original DBA I'm assuming, and an updated one which came out with DBN 2.1. This image that you see in front of you shows the original basing system, which is heavily based on DBA. When DBA came out originally in March 1990, it used the new base sizes first used in WRG 7th edition, and in fact recommended that you use the same basing that WRG 7th edition used. The only exception was the use of 1 1/2 centimeter deep bases for close order infantry. This was abandoned in DBA and obviously with DBN compared with WRG 7th edition. The new base size simply allowed players to increase the depth of their elements by adding a second line figures behind the first line. We'll be covering this in more detail, but the main or the primary reason why this additional basing was introduced in DBN was purely for aesthetics. And I must admit, in some cases, it does definitely have a place. But in summary, we're now a standard 4 centimeters wide, and the depths range from 2 to 4 centimeters. Looking at Vom Kriege, which being a hex-based set of rules has no real element sizes, but the following sizes are suggested. Each unit apparently is made up of 2 elements, each which is 3 centimeters wide, with a fairly low figure density, which is a similar figure density to the 4 centimeter bases of DBN. I don't think we can use these set of rules in order to assist us in determining the optimum base size, mainly because this is a hex-based game which really doesn't care about base sizes. Garde du Corps used the same basing system which the later versions of Empire used and which Napoleon's battles also used. The rules also allowed you to accommodate War Eagle bases with the same width, but War Eagle does have much deeper bases for infantry, being 3 centimeters, and cavalry being 4 centimeters. What we can see here, base width 4 centimeters, no particular surprise here, and the base depth range from 1 1/2 centimeters all the way up to 8 centimeters. Although I must admit, in the artillery case, the reason why it's 8 centimeters because it includes limber. I would assume that the artillery gun and crew probably has a depth of 4 centimeters. So we're beginning to see some common sizes here. 4 wide, cavalry is 3 deep, artillery, or the gun at least, is 4 deep, and the toes possibly additional 4, and infantry in this case is 1 1/2, as distinct from 2 in DBN, but nonetheless pretty close. Now I looked at a pretty long list of additional rules in terms of bases. And the rules that I primarily looked at were what I refer to as not big base rules. Big base rules are basically you have a fairly large base with your figure sitting on top, which acts as strength points. I'm not talking about those rules, we'll be dealing with them later. Now, when we looked at the list of other rules, or at least when I looked at them, the size tended not, well, there seemed to be a great deal of variability in base sizes, and what seemed to be fairly common was the idea that as long as all the bases were the same, we didn't really care what the base sizes were. Nonetheless, in terms of recommended, you generally got a 1 centimetre per infantry figure. That seemed to be fairly common, but even there it was quite variable. As a result, I'm not going to be breaking down the additional rules that I studied in any great detail. I think we've got pretty much all we need from standard rules which attempted to enforce some sort of consistency in base size. Now we come to what I call big base rules, and you can see a list of them here, and they include things such as Bloody Big Battles, Triple C, Blucher. Now these rules really used a completely different philosophy compared to the previous sets of rules. Most of the older rules were very element based, either going from element maneuver rules such as DBN to basically really insisting on having elements at all. Big base rules very much used a large base, and the figures sat inside and they acted as strength points. Now, saying all that, rules such as bloody big battles, for example, for Napoleonics, did commonly use a DBN basing structure to create their big bases. But really, we're not going to be able to get any real guidelines from, let's say, rules such as Blücher or bloody big battles or Grande Armée, etc., because that's not really their thing. Possibly the first thing you may be asking yourself is, why am I using an ancient set of rules in our discussion? The main reason is that, at least in the UK, a basing for Napoleonics often followed or was based on ancient basing. Now, DBMM came out in 2010, and it represented some kind of standard, particularly in ancients world, which was, possibly initially adopted by the DBN people. Now, using DBMM version 2, what we can see here is, guess what? 4 centimetres wide, and our bases ranged from 1.5, 2 to 3. Now, obviously, they didn't have artillery here, but the larger elements, such as elephants, etc., also used a base depth of approximately 4 centimetres. So we're beginning to see something pretty similar to the DBN, obviously, and Garde du Corps, and the 3 sets of rules which basically used a basing system, which that set of rules adopted as well. If we look at a later set of ancient rules, DBA 3rd edition, which came out in 2014, the first interesting trend was that all depths of 1.5 centimetres could also be 2 centimetres. So the new standard depth for infantry was becoming 2 centimetres. Now, in these particular rules, they basically said the depth could either be 1.5 or 2. And you'll notice that in DBN, there is no 1.5 depth. They're all 2. The second change that DBA brought in was this concept of a double element, where the element was a double depth and allowed a doubling of the figure total. This was not available to all figure types, so this is very much a specific rule feature. Now, saying all that, there's certainly no reason why you can't base your normal infantry or possibly even cavalry, although that's less likely, in a double depth base, because often you may deploy elements or units in that particular nature. But that's simply a convenience thing, nothing to do with the rules. DBA introduced the double depth as part of the rules as well. Let's now go to the conclusions after going through all these rules and analysis, so to speak. Okay, the first conclusion is that today an element or a base width of 4 centimetres is the standard or most common base width, and this is probably what you should aim towards. Now, I'm guessing in places which uses imperial measurement, this could possibly translate into 1.5 inches or something, but let's just focus on metric at the present moment. 4 centimetre width is what we're going with. The infantry depth could be either 1.5 centimetres or 2 centimetres, depending on the figure. I would personally these days go with a 2 centimetre depth, as larger base sizes are easier to move and allow for more diorama to be placed on them. But the biggest reason is some of my Prussian line infantry require 2 centimetres to avoid their guns overhanging, and the overhanging is extremely annoying as I store figures, so I tend to go with the 2 centimetres. But if people want to do 1.5, I can't see any particular issue with that as well. Now, artillery is interesting. The whole base, including transport, should be typically 8 centimetres deep. But as I like having the limber separate, I would normally base the artillery on a 4 centimetre base, with the transport being based on a 4 to 8 centimetre depth base, depending on the size of the transports. Now, some of my transports have a 2-horse arrangement, in which case it could handle 4 centimetres. Some have a 4-horse arrangement, in which case it goes 6, and of course the 6-horse you need 8 centimetres. I think the key takeaway here is for things like the transport, or actually all the figures, the depth should be as deep as you need in order to accommodate it. Now, it's interesting, in the micro armour arena, basically the depth isn't really that important, as long as the depth is greater than at least as great as the width, which is 3 centimetres, and the depth can basically be longer in order to accommodate the figure. I see no reason why you can't adopt the same philosophy in Napoleonics or Ancients, but anyway, they attempt to sort of regulate it, and as long as the figure fits on it, great, and if it doesn't, I'd go deeper. Now that we've arrived at our standard base or element sizes, let's look at the figure density. Now, it's easiest for artillery, 1 gun and crew per base. It's all you can fit. If the guns are very small, such as 2-pounders, perhaps you can place 2 on a base, but as I do not use this weapon, or I have not purchased any, I have no idea if this is physically possible, and it's something players could consider. Let's now move to cavalry. Now, 4 figures per base is something a number of rules do use. However, I feel this is unreasonable for two main reasons. It assumes cavalry frontline density is the same as line infantry density, which A, is almost certainly not historically viable. However, the real reason why I disagree with this 4 figure per base density is that many cavalry figures are simply too wide for this type of density. As a result, I've come to the conclusion that 3 figures per base is the maximum density. Saying that, I do have a lot of old minifigs which can actually be fitted on a base in this way, but I just don't think it's a good idea. 2 figures per base is, of course, the other option to 3 figures per base. Now, the issue here is, what does these 2 densities represent? If we use DBN as an example, heavy cavalry, which probably includes medium cavalry as well, is or should be 3 per base, and all light cavalry should be 2 per base. Of course, what is light cavalry in DBN? Hussars light, for example? But the big question is, well, actually with hussars you could probably assume it's light cavalry, but the big question is, what about lancers? Are they light or are they medium or heavy? If we look at the DBN definition for the 3 versus 2 basing, they state heavy cavalry are the Napoleonic knights or mounted shock troops of all armies. Such is the momentum of their charge that when victorious they always pursue a defeated enemy 1 base depth, which unfortunately this definition may not be very helpful. I currently think if you are uncertain, then it probably depends on the figure type. If it's too wide, then select 2. If not, then possibly think about it a bit and decide what density you so desire. What you can see up here is what I currently think, and basically I think uhlans or lancers should be classed as light, and that dragoons, medium, which is the same as heavy in DBN, cuirassiers and carbineers are all heavy, and hussars and the other French versions of lancers, etc., should be all light. But, you know, am I 100% certain? I really cannot say that I am 100% certain. I think a lot of it depends on users. The other factor we need to consider is, what is the rules effect? You know, is there an effect? If you're playing a set of rules which is primarily element based, then it probably doesn't matter how many figures are on the element. The main purpose of it is to allow you to identify what the figure is. And if there's a cavalry guy with a big long stick, then you're pretty certain he's a lancer. And if he doesn't have a big long stick, then maybe he's something else. Let's now move to infantry. When we move to infantry, then musketeers, or what other rules call line infantry, are going to be always 4 figures per base. Light infantry are 3 to a base, primarily so you can identify that they're light, and considering light infantry normally are organised in such a manner to allow them to operate over rough terrain or more mobile, makes sense. And we end up with Jagers or riflemen or skirmishers where we have 2 per base. Now, one interesting idea which DBN brought up was the idea of having a 2-rank base. This is an idea which DBN suggested, I think, in 2014 in its optional rules in order to make your army look nicer, or your figures. Now remember, DBN is an element game where basically you only have 12 elements, so it's probably more relevant for them than other rules. But nonetheless, it's an interesting idea. Now the first point is that this is not 2 elements joined together in order to make it easier to handle the element. This is a standard single element, no different from any other standard single element, which is slightly deeper in order to allow you to base 2 ranks of infantry, purely for aesthetics reasons. In DBN, the suggestion is the base depth should be increased from the 2 cm standard to 2.5 cm. If the figures fit, then this is reasonable. However, I personally feel the base depth should be the same as cavalry. If the rules can handle 2.5 cm, it should be able to handle 3 cm. This picture strongly implies this player has adopted that strategy for some of his bases and the 2.5 cm depth for other bases. However, some figures will not fit even a depth of 2.5 centimeters. So, in this case, I would probably go 3 centimeters in order to allow this to fit onto your base. Now, for the older figures, which tend to be smaller figures, it's no issue. And I suspect that I will actually consider this idea because I think it has merit. It can allow me to deploy a force with bases too deep that looks a little bit nicer. I think definitely for DBN this is a good idea. For other rules, it depends on the rules. Now, I have thousands and thousands of Prussians, far more than I can ever possibly use. So for me, creating a whole army in this way doesn't really affect me because I can have a completely separate army which uses a completely different basing ideology. But if you're possibly purchasing an army from scratch, you may think twice of this strategy unless there's a real objective behind it. Now, not the slightly deeper base to allow for 2 ranks, but another idea which DBA version 3 brings up, which I think is interesting, and I've been thinking about it quite a bit, and that is double depth bases. That is 2 bases joined together with 2 ranks. If the rules encourage players to deploy elements one behind each other, then it may be useful to create these double bases, thus making it easier to move bases. It also looks good and makes the element easy to move. However, this greatly depends on the rules being used. For Napoleonics, I feel this may not be viable unless you have a lot of figures. So I'll think about it, but generally I probably will mainly use this idea for ancients rather than Napoleonics. On the other hand, one of the sets of rules that I use generally encourages you to have quite deep formations as much as possible, so maybe I'll change my mind. But nonetheless, it's an interesting idea. Now, the main reason why you would do this is it really does make it a lot easier to move these elements around. Now, another thought I had is if your objective is to make it easier to move lots of elements around, using movement trays may be the best way to go, and that's certainly another thing that I'll be thinking about. What we see here is an image of an army. Most of the infantry are too deep, and quite frankly, it does actually make the figures look a lot better. Now, if you look carefully, these elements are not joined together. I'm just using this image as an example of what it could look like if the elements are joined together. But if your rules greatly encourage you to have 2 ranks all the time, or even more, then, once again, it's certainly something to consider. Let's look at the concept of half bases. Many early rules used half bases for skirmishes. For some scale, this may be viable. However, for some rule scales or rules that do a particular scale, this may be viable. However, I prefer to deploy skirmishes on a standard base, but with only 2 figures per base. I think this lighter density looks better and is far more realistic. Skirmishers did not maintain a frontage of 2 feet per man when they were skirmishing. They spread out. This requires players to have separate skirmish elements, I agree, but in a standard force mix of 50 elements, you probably only need a maximum of 12 skirmish elements, so it's something I would certainly consider. Of course, the rules that I normally play at the present moment is a much higher scale, where the idea of having a couple of your guys in each battalion act as skirmishers just isn't important. It's all built into the formation, so I don't need that at all. I only need the light infantry, that is infantry in open order, for specialised riflemen or Jager, etc. type troops. But the lower scale, like the original WRG, many of the battalions allowed you to split off 2 or 4 of the figures into half-base skirmishers, and that's basically a part of the rule system. So, part 24 of my figure gaming series of videos comes to a close, and now I have a good idea how I should base my Napoleonic figures. I will now order some bases and start the process. One aspect I did not cover in this video is the thickness of the base to use. I normally use 3mm bases for 6mm micro armour because it allows me to label the edges and pick up the base far more easily. However, for 15mm Napoleonics, I do not need to label the edge, and there is no issue with picking up the base because the figures are much larger. So, as a result, I'm fully intending to go down the 2mm base thickness path. Denken Sie daran, immer für Heimatland zu kämpfen.